Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to build on chapter 12. Chapter 12 ended with the description of the aggregate demand curve, which, it's hoping here that the pen is all working here, and it's not. We could do charcoal. Let's see here. Which gave us price and real GDP, and gave us an aggregate demand curve that was downward sloping. And the reason for that aggregate demand curve is it came from our Keynesian cross, our 45-degree line, where aggregate expenditures equaled real GDP. And aggregate expenditures, which was at a slope, and this being our point of equilibrium. And that as the price changes, so here's our real GDP, here's my aggregate expenditures, that as the price level changes, the aggregate expenditures change. As we see a change in price, let's say that it's going up, then what we see is that consumption falls. That leads to eventually planned investment falling, and it leads to net exports falling as people buy more stuff abroad. So this is saying price levels change in the US and go higher than the world. With all of these falling, what we would see is that AE falls. Which, in essence, where we would see our real GDP falling as our price level increases. So each of these points are equilibrium points on the Keynesian cross, which is what appears right here. Okay, so that was chapter 12, this kind of graph on the side here. So if that seems a little unclear, my suggestion is watch the chapter 12 video again. But starting from there, now the question is what are we going to do with this aggregate demand curve? And we're going to add to it an aggregate supply curve. Okay, so let's go. I'm just going to jump over things like this. Okay, so what we see is in the aggregate demand function is that the aggregate demand is the real GDP, the consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And what we see is that, for the most part, government purchases really don't depend on the price level. So we can include them or not include them, it doesn't really matter. But what's really affected by the price level is the consumption, the investment, and the net exports. We saw that already in the previous chapter. And what we're going to do from that work, what we're going to do with this is we're going to combine our aggregate demand function with an aggregate supply function, which is going to be upward sloping, just like how our supply curve was way back in chapter 3. So here's our aggregate demand function, downward sloping. The reason why it's downward sloping is different than why the demand curve is downward sloping. Here we're saying that as the price level falls, consumption goes up, investment goes up, net exports go up. And as those components of the aggregate expenditures go up, what we see is that the aggregate demand, the real GDP, goes up. Because again, it's all points of equilibrium on the Keynesian cross. We're combining with that a supply curve. Now this is another kind of Keynesian innovation here. And this is called the short run aggregate supply. And that at least in the short run, that what we see is that there's a positive relationship between the price level and the supply of real GDP, the production by other firms. We're going to see that there's a different shape of the aggregate supply curve in the long run, and we'll see that here shortly. And then the question comes down to when we look at the aggregate demand function, that we need to look at how certain factors are being affected, with one of these being the wealth effect. As you would expect, that as price levels change, people feel wealthier. Sorry, as price levels, I said as price levels fall. Well, let's just do what's on the slide here. As price levels rise, people feel poorer, right? Their wealth can't buy as much because the price levels have gone up. And so as they feel less wealthy, their consumption falls. Okay, so that's our wealth effect. So here what we're doing is, this would be reason number one why aggregate demand is downward sloping. For demand, way back in chapter 3, it was really easy. We just said law of demand. Here, for aggregate demand, there are going to be multiple reasons why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. And the first of these is my wealth effect. Okay, well, let's just hope that it improves here. The second of these is my interest rate effect. And what I see with my interest rate effect that as the interest rate changes, people can't borrow as much, so consumption is falling. That investment falls. And theoretically, net exports would change as well. They just don't put that on the slide here. So this is our second reason why aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. And then the third reason is called the international trade effect. And here we're talking about U.S. price levels compared to international price levels. And that if U.S. price levels rise, then people in other countries don't buy as much of our stuff, and we tend to buy more imports. All three of these reasons, the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect, all show how changing the price leads to changes in the real GDP. And so there we go. 3 reasons why aggregate demand curve shows that as the price level falls, real GDP rises. 3 reasons. And just like we did in chapter 3, we need to distinguish between moving along the curve versus shifting the curve. Moving along the curve means that we are employing ceteris paribus, meaning that the only time that we move along the curve is when we change the price level. Again, this is going to be our wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. Everything else held constant, moving along the curve. If something else changes, like other than price, then we shift the curve. What would one of those things be? And this is part of the Keynesian innovation here. Would be if I do something like shift to G. Because what that does, if we go back to the Keynesian cross, is it shifts this. And it makes my equilibrium different, which in essence would increase this. That would be my shift caused by changing government spending, for instance, changing investment, changing net export, changing consumption fundamentally. But the biggest one we generally see here would be changing government spending. And what we would see here is that based on this analysis then, when we look at this from a perspective of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, one of the things that we can do is shift the aggregate demand curve. And we can shift it in one of two types of government policy. The first one being monetary policy, and that would be monetary policy is when I change the money supply. Changing the money supply leads to a change in the interest rate, which leads to a change in consumption and a change in investment. Changing the money supply changes the interest rate, which leads to a change in consumption and investment. That's monetary policy. Which is, and again, what we start to see with Keynesian policy is this discussion, at least, this broader discussion of what monetary policy does. And then what we also then see is this discussion of fiscal policy, which would mean changing G or changing T, which leads to changing consumption, changing investment, and thus changing the AD curve. I should be more specific here, sorry. Changing taxes leads to these changes, or we get this change on its own. And you see this right here, that changing taxes leads to changes in consumption and investment. Changing government purchases just changes it directly. So again, now we have our two methods here of what we're going to try to do to change the economy. So think back to this. That would mean that if we looked at chapter 7 and 8, that we kind of take a pulse of how the economy is doing based on our understanding of where we're at for GDP, unemployment, and inflation. Then we determine, is the economy healthy or not? And if the economy is not healthy, then what we need to do is we need to make changes to monetary policy and fiscal policy that lead to changes in AD to basically fix the economy. Other things, though, that could affect the economy is we could change people's expectations. We could make them more or less optimistic. So we've got fiscal policy, monetary policy, changing expectations to be able to shift the AD curve. And this should be pretty obvious. More optimistic shifts aggregate demand to the right. Less optimistic shifts aggregate demand curve to the left. And then we could also change the exchange rate. And if we make the exchange rate more friendly to people buying U.S. goods, then aggregate demand will shift to the right. If we make U.S. produced goods more expensive, then net exports would fall, which would mean aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. Okay, I'm just going to skip this here. And so that brings us to, again, this distinction between the short run and the long run aggregate supply curve. So we need to develop both of these. Now, the long run aggregate supply curve my plan of always doing this so that it I don't know why it's not happening. So our long run aggregate supply curve is determined by the PPF. Remember that from chapter 2? Good X, quantity of good X, quantity of good Y. Here on my PPF, this is determining levels of production, which in my case here, I could have my aggregate demand curve. And where this long run aggregate supply curve intersects is coming from my PPF. But what we see is that in the long run, in terms of production levels, that there is no relationship between the price level and the real GDP. Right, because price changes and real GDP does not change at all. The only thing we can do is we can shift the entire long-run aggregate supply curve. But what that requires is any of those things that can shift out or shift in the PPF, such as having more people, more better technology, more capital stock. So just remind yourself of that back from chapter 2. But what you can see here is that the long-run aggregate supply curve looks to be shifting to the right, presumably because we have more capital, we have more people, something along those lines, but not because of any price levels. It's not going to, changing the price level does not change the level of real GDP, at least in the long run. Where you see those changes are in the short run. And that naturally brings up the question of why is the short-run aggregate supply curve upward sloping? And the reason for this is because of stickiness and misperceptions. So let's talk about what that means. When we say that a wage or a price is sticky, we mean that it doesn't change as quickly as we kind of thought things changed back in chapter 3. So if things don't change that quickly, maybe because there's a contract. So for instance, I'm in a union and I have a labor contract. My labor contract just got signed and it commits my wage for the next 2 years. Now, what that means though is that if there's rampantly high inflation, my wage is not going to change. It's sticky, at least for 2 years. Now, eventually it will become unstuck, and then we probably cease to be in the short run. No one really knows how long the long run is or how short the short run is. Someone asked John Maynard Keynes that, and he famously said, well, in the long run, we're all dead, which doesn't really help us figure out how long something is. But that's what we mean by stickiness, is that wages and prices might be slow to change. Prices might be slow to change because there's contracts that lock in the price for a certain period of time. Besides the stickiness, what we also can see are misperceptions. That if your price, let's say you're selling something, and you raise the price, you might mistakenly think that you're getting a higher price relative to other goods. But you don't really know that because you know the price of what you're selling really, really well. You don't know as well the price of other goods that you're selling. So there's a bit of a misperception. And also, too, my wages might be going up, but I might think that all other goods I'm buying aren't increasing as quickly. But maybe they are. Maybe there's a misperception for me as the worker. And then finally, what we have is this idea that some menu costs are sticky, meaning that it costs money for firms to change their prices, so they might not do it all the time. So with this idea that there's some stickiness involved in prices, I'm just going to skip over that. That would also mean, again, that we have to talk about shifting the curve versus moving along the curve. Same difference. What is it that I do that would change the price level? That's going to be my movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve. Something other than changing the price is going to shift the curve. So then the question is what are those things that we could shift? One of those things, again, that we could cause this shift in the curve would be my expectations of future prices. If I expect future prices to be higher by 3%, but it turns out that it doesn't, then, right, I'm going to shift the curve as a reaction to my belief that prices in the future are going to be going up by 3%. In essence, it does create a self-fulfilling prophecy, though, as you can see here, where the prices actually do increase by that amount. And what we can also see in terms of things that are shifting my curves, it comes down to things like productivity, and it comes down to things like changing my technology, changing my factors of production. Basically, anything that shifts the just levels of production overall. Changing my factors of production, changing my technology, the way that I combine inputs together to produce an output. And then again, changing the expectations of my future prices, and then then just the misperceptions of things, and underestimating or overestimating the price. A final thing that can shift the short-run aggregate supply curve would be a shock. COVID is a perfect example of a shock to the short-run aggregate supply curve. Other things would be like a freeze, a weather event, a sudden change in oil prices, a war. All these things would shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. And so now what we need to do is we need to put these two curves together and think about how things change and how the curves would change as events happen and what kind of impact that has on the real GDP levels. So as we look at this, here's the beautiful part, right? Here's where everything is great in the economy. Aggregate demand intersecting short-run aggregate supply, which is also intersecting the long-run aggregate supply curve. This is an economy that's in complete and total equilibrium. And now what this graph also highlights here is that there's a difference between the economy being in a short-run equilibrium and being in a long-run equilibrium. Because what I could do is I could draw an economy that's in a short-run equilibrium, but is to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve. Or alternatively, I could draw an economy that's in a short-run equilibrium, but is to the right of the long-run aggregate supply. And what we're going to see is that this is called a recessionary gap. And we're going to see that this here is called an inflationary gap. And what this represented when Keynes outlined this was in our first true graphical understanding of what causes a recession. That a recession, in essence, is just when the economy is in a short-run equilibrium that's different than the long-run equilibrium. And so that then, essentially what we need to do is we need to do something, this would be the Keynesian discussion, is that we need to do something to shift the economy to the long run. How? By changing C, by changing I, and by changing G. Fiscal policy. And monetary policy. Or that if I'm over here, sorry, I need to do something that's going to bring my economy back to equilibrium now here. And so that's also going to be my monetary and fiscal policy. We're going to see here that I'm going to, in this example, I'm going to use expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. And over here, I'm going to use contractionary policy. Meaning I'm going to reduce things. And so you're looking at this graph. If I hadn't drawn what I did on the previous slide, you'd look at this and be like, what the fuck is going on? In essence, they tried to do both graphs in the same graph, and you don't need to make your life that tough. Right, so what would point B represent? Point B would represent being in a recession. And what the argument here is that what we could do is we could push the economy out of this recession that it's at with point B. So at point B, you could do nothing and just let the economy slowly adjust to C. As the price level's higher, then the price level being higher will cause changes, and the GDP, real GDP being lower, will cause changes to the economy, causing the price level to fall until it gets down to C, which is our long run. So the economy will eventually always go back to its equilibrium, but we might want to speed that process up and just shift the AD curve out. The problem is that just like anything, there's a consequence to it. You can shift the AD curve and get a faster solution, but you end up with permanently higher prices. A has higher prices than C, even though they have the same real GDP level. And again, you could, instead of shifting the aggregate demand curve, you could, what you would see here in that movement from B to C is that you're getting that movement from B to C because the short-run aggregate supply curve is slowly adjusting over time. And it goes in the opposite direction as well, or on the opposite side. When we have this inflationary gap, which is kind of what we were experiencing about a year ago in the U.S. economy in 2023, 2022, is that the price levels were higher. And so what you could do is you could wait for the economy to fix itself and go from B to C, or you could try to shift the curve from AD2 to AD1. I'm kind of going opposite of what this graph is, but I'm trying to explain what happened in 2022, 2023. And you could do that by, for instance, raising interest rates, which is what we did to shift us from AD2 to AD1. But what it presumably can do is cause unemployment rates to rise, which is the if you look in the news, you'll see things like soft landing, which is what kind of the primary concern was. And that based on all this too, you see these changing expectations. The other thing you can kind of do here is you can have a shock occurring in some kind of way. So again, like COVID, like a war, something along those lines, can cause a dramatic shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. And as you can see here, it's moving an economy that was in equilibrium at point A into a recession. So obviously that was the concern with COVID, is that it was going to cause a recession, and it did. Or why even something like a war could cause a recession. And again, if you have this kind of recession happening, this kind of supply shock happening, all you can really do is kind of just hope that the economy will fix itself. But again, it's going to take time. To move from B to A could take anywhere from 2 to 5 years. And you might not want to wait that long. And you see that same thing, again, just kind of happening here. And you see this with COVID again. They just have a general discussion here. I'm just going to, just to make, COVID was important. I'm not dismissing that. I don't know why. The authors want to emphasize it because they think that that's the only way you'll be interested in this class. I don't want to focus all of my attention on that. Okay, that brings us to then making this a dynamic model. I am going to make the executive choice here not to do the dynamic model. This chapter is already hard enough as it is without also adding on to it the dynamic model. So the dynamic model will not appear on the exam. You'll have a little bit to do with it on the homework, but it's not anything too significant. But I am not going to be covering that on the exam. Nor am I going to cover the macroeconomic schools of thought, although they're really important and they help you understand a bit more about why there's these differences in macroeconomists. I mean, to be honest, there's not many Keynesians anymore as there used to be. For myself, I'm a bit more of a monetarist. But, you know, people, there's just different schools of economic thought here. If you find that kind of thing interesting, then obviously read the appendix. And I'm happy to make you a video if you want me to talk more about those slides. But I won't subject all of you to it. So again, I don't want you to focus on the dynamic model nor on the appendix, the last two parts here. It makes an otherwise very difficult chapter a little bit easier and a little bit more manageable. Okay, so that makes this, again, this material a little bit less difficult.